This is 416 and our definition of tension. There's an old piece of wisdom in screenwriting, and it tells us that our first responsibility before everything else is to keep them in their seats. That pertains to tension. Tension is something that the audience feels while watching the movie as they anticipate things that are going to happen in the future. Most of the terms and most of the concepts we learn in class are about tools that the screenwriter uses to manipulate and enhance and modulate tension. You may notice the tension caused by the sound of my dog chewing a rawhide bone. The specific definition that we're going to be using is this. Tension is a state of anticipation in which the audience hopes for one outcome but fears another. Okay, so let's take this definition of tension and relate it to the definition of story that you learned in the previous video. When the protagonist wants something very badly but is having trouble getting it, the audience will start to imagine how things might turn out for the protagonist. And they will start to hope for it turning out one way and fear that it'll turn out in another way. Now, in this case, it's pretty simple. What the protagonist wants and what the protagonist hopes and fears is pretty much identical to what the audience is hoping and fearing. But it's important to understand that tension and what the audience is feeling is not necessarily the same as what the protagonist is feeling. For example, the audience might have a piece of information that the protagonist doesn't have. What if that glass were not filled with water, but the audience knew from a previous scene that it was actually filled with gasoline? Then there would be a different set of hopes and fears. Or you could imagine it this way. What if the protagonist is an anti-hero? He is an evil dragon tamer and he abuses his animals so that we actually empathize with the dragon who is now fearlessly resisting the evil dragon trader trying to grab the water. And the point is, the hopes and fears of the audience might be completely inverted. As it turns out, the multiple layers of tension can get quite complex in some of the movies that we're going to see this semester. But always keep in mind, the story is about what the protagonist is doing. Tension is about what the audience anticipates might happen as a result. This might seem really simple to you, but the reality is that most of my friends who are agents or managers or who read screenplays for contests or for screenwriting festivals will say that among the top 3 things that most screenplays lack is a sense of tension, a sense of the story making you want to turn the page. Interior, screenwriter's office, night. In general, what you want is for the tension to be a juxtaposition of extremes. Whatever it is you're hoping for has to be really good, and whatever it is that is feared has to be really bad. If what you hope for isn't all that different than what you fear, the tension is lost. Similarly, in order for tension to work, there has to be a certain sense of uncertainty in that anticipation. As soon as the audience becomes fairly certain that one outcome is the way the story's going, then regardless of whether that outcome is good or bad, they become bored because they know how it's going to end.
Oh, such a good doggy. Such a good dog.
And as I was editing this video, I realized that the most common way that screenplays lack tension is when the audience or the reader is just simply confused, or because one thing just keeps happening after another without any sense of where it's leading, they can't imagine any futures. And so there is no hope and no fear because you can't really imagine what might happen next. Over the course of the class, as we watch all these different movies, we'll investigate all sorts of different types of tension. Over the 3-act structure, we'll look at the general story tension that covers the entire arc of the story. We'll look at the 3rd act tension. We'll look at the tension of sequences. We'll look at the tension of individual scenes. But what I want you to focus on now is something that we call the main tension. The main tension is the tension that spans the 2nd act. It is established when the 1st act ends, and it is resolved before the 3rd act begins. So again, when I talk about the main tension, I'm talking about specifically the tension that is created in the 2nd act when the protagonist pursues his or her or their very particular want. But now we're starting to talk about acts and scenes and sequences. That is the subject for the next video, structure, which will introduce you to the sequence approach. This is what we call repetition with variation. But for now, just remember this definition of tension. Tension is a state of anticipation in which the audience hopes for one outcome but fears another.